We often hear archaeologists talking about items belonging to the Stone Age or Bronze Age or Iron Age. To complicate matters, these classifications are further broken down into what sound like quite plausible groupings. The Stone Age, for example, is broken down into Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods. Even these are broken down further into finer classifications. The same goes for the Bronze Age and Iron Age, and it is not uncommon to hear archaeologists using such terminology as Early Bronze Age 1, 2, 3 or 4, or Middle Bronze Age 1, 2A, 2B or 2C, or Late Bronze Age 1, 2A or 2B, and so on. We are told that the Bronze Age was replaced by the Iron Age in the Middle East around 1200 BCE. But, as we shall proceed to demonstrate, this is simply not true. The theory of the Stone Age Bronze Age to Iron Age progression originated with a Danish antiquarian by the name of Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, the curator of the Museum of Northern Antiquities, later the Danish National Museum, in Copenhagen from 1816 to 1865. One of his first jobs was to arrange the collections in the museum into some semblance of order. Professor Nyrup, whose collections he worked on, had been unable to put them into any sort of order. The findings were not even classed according to any stratigraphic sequence, and yet Thomsen's theory was to emerge from this chaos. To put it bluntly, Thomsen could just as easily have arranged the collection according to rock, paper, scissors, if you get my drift, and no one would have been any the wiser. In other words, his system of dating did not emerge from any scientific consideration of the find positions because that information did not exist. He introduced a theory and then made the evidence fit that theory. In discussing Thomsen's system of dating, Robert Heiser argues that there is a hint in the works of the classical writers that history went through some sort of age sequence. He refers, for example, to the Greek writer Hesiod, arguing that Hesiod, in his works and days, written in the 7th century BC, speaks of 5 ages of man, the series being referred to as gold, silver, bronze, heroic and iron. In referring to the Bronze race, he says that at this time there was no iron. It is accepted, however, that there was no Gold Age, there was no Silver Age, nor was there a Heroic Age. Hesiod was speaking metaphorically, and yet these people have taken him literally. Note in particular that Hesiod does not mention any Stone Age. Believe it or not, the whole notion of a Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age progression is not represented in the archaeological record. In discussing this problem, Coles and Harding wrote, "We do not see the European Bronze Age as a period that can be easily separated from preceding or succeeding prehistoric developments, and in many ways the divisions Neolithic, Copper Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age become more and more artificial as cultural and environmental evidence for continuity accumulates through landscape as well as typological studies." The Israeli archaeologist Emanuel Anati puts it even more bluntly when he writes, "This terminology turned out to be obsolete, as bronze was not introduced into common use until about 1,000 years after the beginning of the period. On the other hand, the term Bronze Age is usually used in Europe and elsewhere for societies which had no urban settlements and whose economic, social and political bases were different from those we find in the Near East at this time. Despite this realization, Anati used another flawed method of dating. He believed that man started off as a primitive hunter. Gradually he learned how to farm the land until eventually he became civilized and built cities in which to live. Consequently, everything is classified by Anati to proto-urban or urban. As we shall proceed to demonstrate, this assumption also is not supported by either the written or the archaeological evidence. Also, in the Bible, it clearly states in 2 Kings 13 verse 5 that Israel was still dwelling in tents during the time of Jehoahaz son of Jehu. And Jehoahaz besought the Lord, and the Lord hearkened unto him. For he saw the oppression of Israel, because the king of Syria oppressed them. And the Lord gave Israel a saviour, so that they went out from under the hand of the Syrians. And the children of Israel dwelt in their tents as before time. During the time of Amaziah we likewise read, But Amaziah would not hear. Therefore Jehoash king of Israel went up, and he and Amaziah king of Judah looked one another in the face at Bethshemesh, which belongeth to Judah. And Judah was put to the worse before Israel, and they fled every man to their tents. Even during the time of Hezekiah king of Judah, this being when Sennacherib king of Assyria invaded the land, Israel was still dwelling in tents. And these, written by name, referring to an Israeli family rather than the king of Assyria, came in the days of Hezekiah king of Judah, and smote their tents and the habitations that were found there, and destroyed them utterly unto this day, and dwelt in their place, because there was pasture there for their flocks. This revelation that Israel were generally dwelling in tents rather than in cities immediately throws any logical dating system into disrepute. Let's face it, those people who were dwelling in tents, tending their herds and flocks, were not likely to have had the same expensive taste in pottery or jewellery, or have had the same sort of metallurgical skills as those dwelling in the towns or the cities. We are assured by archaeologists that the Iron Age started shortly before the time of King David. In the Bible, however, we read that before the great flood of Noah's day, Tubal-Cain was an instructor of every artificer in bronze and iron. During their 40 years wandering in the wilderness, we are told that Israel smote Og king of Bashan, whose bedstead was a bedstead of iron. During the time of Joshua, the Israelites complained that the Canaanites had chariots of iron. But who wants to believe the Bible? If we look at the details of the construction of Solomon's temple, all of the objects made for the temple service were either of gold or bronze. Iron is barely mentioned, other than an oblique reference to the fact that the stones prepared for the building of Solomon's temple were cut well away from the temple site, so that there was neither the sound of hammer, nor axe, nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in building. David prepared iron in abundance for the nails for the doors of the gates and for the joinings. But none of the temple furnishings were made of iron. Hiram's father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding and cunning to work all works in bronze. On this evidence, then, this was the Bronze Age at its height, not the Iron Age. The Bible tells us that metals were constantly reused. And Eleazar the priest said unto the men of war which went to the battle against Midian, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord commanded Moses. Only the gold and the silver, the bronze, the iron, the tin, and the lead, everything that may abide the fire, you shall make it go through the fire, and it shall be clean. This could mean that they were simply passed through as a cleansing process, or it might well mean that the metals were melted down and reused. In the book of Joshua we read, "And they burnt the city with fire and all that was therein. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of bronze and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord." This would suggest in this particular case that the vessels were not melted down. However, I somehow cannot see that the Israelites would have taken items representing pagan gods into the house of the Lord, especially during the time of Joshua. Either way, whether melted down or not, these passages tell us that these items were being reused, something which archaeologists do not seem to take into consideration. The reuse of metals is discussed by J.G. McQueen, who, because no metals have been found in excavations in Anatolia, commented that developments in metallurgy are so often difficult to follow because of lack of evidence. Unlike scrap pottery, scrap metal can be and normally is melted down for reuse, and it is only by chance that specimens survive. We look at what the Greek writers tell us, and we find that the use of metals depended on availability. Herodotus tells us, "The Massagetæ equipped their horses similarly, protecting their chests with bronze breastplates and putting gold on reins, bits and cheek plates. But they never use iron and silver, for there is none at all in their country. But gold and bronze abound." He also informs us that the Scythians do not use silver or bronze. Psammetichus I, king of Egypt, we are told, had a bronze helmet. Meanwhile, the Ionians and Carians, who arrived in Egypt during his reign, wore whole suits of armour made of bronze. Herodotus also informs us that, among the Ethiopians, there is nothing so scarce and so precious as bronze. During the Persian Wars, the Ethiopians were attired in leopard skins and lion skins and were using primitive weapons, bows made of palmwood strips no less than 4 cubits long, and short arrows pointed not with iron but with the sharpened stone that they used to carve seals. Furthermore, they had spears pointed with a gazelle's horn sharpened like a lance, and also studded clubs. Does this sound like the Iron Age to you? Is this not reminiscent of what is being called the Stone Age? During the time of Alexander the Great, we are told by Diodorus that the Tyrians had bronze workers and machinists and contrived ingenious countermeasures. They also fashioned shields of bronze and iron. The palace at Persepolis in Persia, built by the Achaemenid kings, had huge bronze doors with bronze poles or pillars, 20 cubits, that is 30 feet or 9 metres high each side. Consider the technology involved in building gates and pillars that high out of bronze. Even Alexander the Great had the habit of melting down metals and reusing them. The Bronze Age cannot therefore be separated from the Iron Age or the Stone Age. This whole terminology and classification is therefore false. It is a pseudoscience. The same problems are inherent in the archaeological record. A few iron beads used as jewellery have been discovered in 2 graves at Gerza near the Fayum and dated to around 3000 BCE, though they have proved to be of meteoric content. Nevertheless, the iron had to be processed, which means that the ability to manufacture iron objects is shown to predate the assumed start date of the Iron Age. An iron tool was also discovered at the Great Pyramid at Giza, but it is claimed that this item was intrusive. Whilst this might well be the case in this instance, I have nevertheless time and again come across this excuse to explain away anomalies simply because it does not fit the archaeologists' interpretations. Even so, a number of chisels and other iron tools dating from the 5th dynasty were found at Saqqara, and several pieces of a pickaxe from the 6th dynasty were unearthed at Abu Sir. According to archaeologists' estimations, these iron tools are dated more than 2,000 years before the introduction of the so-called Iron Age. At Abydos in Egypt, Sir William Flinders Petrie discovered a lump of iron dust, probably a wedge and dated by him to the 6th dynasty. Rusted onto this group of tools, and certainly belonging to it, was a mass of iron which may have been a wedge. This is over 2,000 years older than any iron yet known in Egypt, and is therefore of great importance as showing that occasionally iron was known at a far earlier age than that of its ordinary use. During the Al Amarna period, Tushratta of Mitanni wrote to the 18th dynasty king Amenhotep III, saying that he was sending him a sacred knife of iron and iron rings covered with gold. To his son Akhenaten he also sent iron rings covered with gold, and a dagger the blade of which was of iron, and the handle of gold set with precious stones. Again, this is dated long before the Iron Age supposedly occurred. A sword of exquisite workmanship with an iron blade has been discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb, including a number of other iron objects. As you can see from the picture, the sword displays a high degree of craftsmanship and shows an advanced stage of iron production. Of the sword, the remark was made that this metal of Hittite origin and of the greatest rarity and value was destined to change the world. To date it has not changed the world, as archaeologists still use this spurious method of dating. But we are assured by Stephen Quirk and Geoffrey Spencer that the specimens from his tomb suggest that iron was scarce in Egypt at that period. It certainly wasn't rare in other parts of the world though, judging by the amount of iron mentioned in the Al Amarna letters. But archaeologists simply ignore that important piece of evidence. In fact, we are assured that it is not until the Ptolemaic period, some 800 years after the Iron Age was supposed to have started, that iron tools are found in Egypt in any great quantity. If that is the case, why is the period before that time called the Iron Age? It simply does not make sense. We are informed by Garland and Bannister that the date of the commencement of the Iron Age in Egypt is perennially discussed, and unfortunately but little fresh evidence comes along as time progresses. And furthermore, the Iron Age may yet be proved to have even preceded the Bronze Age. Sir William Flinders Petrie even commented that iron has had more contradictory statements made about it than any other metal. The sad fact of the matter is that, apart from ceramic evidence, archaeologists have nothing else to fall back on. But does that make the acceptance of an inappropriate method of dating right? At the ancient Phoenician site of Motia, a small island off the extreme western tip of Sicily, we find archaeological evidence to demonstrate that the Bronze and Stone Age coexisted. The Motians apparently had a connection with an earlier, more primitive people, who seem to have had one foot still in the Stone Age. At the ancient city of Jaffa, J. Kaplan excavated an area lying within the assumed limits of the citadel. Despite finding remains in this area dating from most eras right back to Middle Bronze Age 2A, no Iron Age remains could be found, even though another area 40 metres to the east produced such remains. At Tal Kharashim in Upper Galilee, the Middle Bronze Age 1 level is said to have been succeeded by an early phase of the Iron Age. Yet comparisons of pottery from the Iron Age level have been made with late Bronze Age pottery from Chatzor. This makes this early phase of Iron Age contemporary with the late Bronze Age. At Tel al-Farah in northern Israel, this being the ancient city of Tirsach, excavations reveal that during the Iron Age, the Israelites were still building according to the custom of the Middle Bronze Age. At Iron Age Gezer, archaeologists found degenerate platter bowls, carinated bowls, craters, juglets and cooking pots, all marking the end of a tradition going back to the Middle Bronze Age. At Tal al-Ayl, originally identified by Petrie as the ancient city of Gaza, but now believed to have been the ancient city of Bet Eglaim, evidence from nearby tombs proved that the city was occupied during the Iron Age, yet the archaeological results from the city proper do not support such occupation. Albright suggested that Palace 5 might belong to the 10th century BC. If so, it would be the only Iron Age building on the mound. Apart from a few iron arrowheads, there are no recognisable objects of the period on the mound. This is the explanation they give for the anomaly. It must be assumed that either they were swept away by wind and rain, or the main population had by then moved to the site of modern Gaza, but continued to bury their dead in the long-established cemeteries. This explanation is somewhat contrived. Once again, archaeologists do not make allowance for the fact that metals were often reused. The list of problems archaeologists have encountered with this false Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age theory goes on. No one is prepared to challenge what has become a firmly established doctrine. It gets no better when we look at the written evidence. The Greek historian Diodorus, who lived from 80 BCE to 20 BCE, described the various peoples who inhabited the Middle East during his day. Among the many communities he described, there were those who went about naked, whose only weapons were sharp goat horns and that which nature provided. There were those who lived in caves, those who used whalebones which were woven together with seaweed to form a tent, and those who used olive trees which were likewise woven together to form a tent. Using the age theory, these communities belong to about 3000 BCE, if not earlier. This alone shows that the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age progression is nothing more than an academic invention. In theory, dating by pottery should be the most accurate means of dating. We look at the style of pottery and can often tell whether it is Aegean, Levantine or whatever. Unfortunately, the dating of pottery is also fraught with problems. Professor Leonard Palmer, one of the philologists responsible for translating the Greek Linear B texts, questioned the accuracy of Sherd-based history in the early 1960s. He became suspicious when the clay tablets, which had been retrieved from the ancient Greek city of Knossos by the renowned English archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, kept referring to large numbers of a type of jar called a stirrup jar. The problem he encountered was that the tablets were dated to a different era to the many stirrup jars which were found on the site. Palmer insisted quite logically that they both belonged to the same period. What his investigations revealed was that the clay tablets mentioning the stirrup jars were located on the ground floor of the building, whilst the stirrup jars themselves were located on the first floor. When the floor collapsed due to a conflagration which destroyed the palace, the floor separated the contents of the ground and first floors. Archaeologists treated the two floors as two different periods of history, separated by some 500 years. The chronology of late Minoan pottery is based on the stratification at Knossos. According to the conventional belief, late Minoan 1 and 2 are supposed to have preceded late Minoan 3. But, as Professor Palmer discovered, a late Minoan 1 or 2 vase now forms part of the burnt debris deposited above a pavement that had sealed in late Minoan 3B bowls. In addition, stone jars dated stylistically to late Minoan 2 were found in an unfinished state, and it was correctly concluded that they represented work in progress during the last days before the city was destroyed by a conflagration. As noted by Professor Palmer, this means that late Minoan 2 jars were still being produced during the late Minoan 3B period, if not later. As Palmer records, finally, doubts are stimulated on a still more fundamental matter. Archaeologists draw minute distinctions between pottery styles. They have concluded that the palace at Knossos was destroyed when an early phase of late Minoan 3A, known as late Minoan 3A1, was in vogue, and the post-destruction period at Knossos began with a late phase of the style known as late Minoan 3A2. Leading Aegean archaeologists are now expressing doubts on this basic matter. My own researches support them. If, for instance, some vessels classified as late Minoan 1A and late Minoan 1B are actually later than some classified as late Minoan 3B, then much of the current picture of Aegean prehistory lies in ruins. As Professor Levy has written, we must wipe the slate clean and start all over from the very beginning. This making of fine distinctions between pottery styles is therefore as fundamentally flawed as the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age theory. Nevertheless, it does not stop archaeologists from using such classifications for the purposes of dating the archaeological evidence. In the spring of 1905, Sir Arthur Evans presented to an international congress a Minoan pottery sequence which is still to a great extent used to this day, albeit with some modifications to the early Minoan and middle Minoan sequences. Duncan Mackenzie, who took over from Evans at Knossos, wrote a letter to him querying his whole system of classification. What emerges clearly from the letter is that Evans, as late as September 1905, had no inkling of what had been found in the way of early Minoan pottery at Knossos. Mackenzie was at a loss to understand how his employer had come to imagine his carefully distinguished strata. Yet, in the spring of that year, 1905, Evans had communicated to an international congress his famous Système de classification, which was to remain canonical and is still defended. This was not the only contrivance Professor Leonard Palmer found when studying the field reports. He wrote, "What has emerged throughout the palace and the course of its excavation is a picture of adjustment, suppression and invention of archaeological data. I have come across similar problems myself when studying the Assyrian and Egyptian records. Archaeologists will manipulate the data to fit their interpretations and will rarely challenge their original assumptions." Coarse handmade pottery has been found in many Mycenaean sites. Perhaps the first thing to notice is its likeness to a sort of kitchenware that has turned up all over Europe from the Neolithic onwards. When it appears in much greater quantities alongside Mycenaean 3C pots at Karaku, Asin and to some extent at Mycenae II, the presence of northern invaders has been suspected. In other words, pottery, which is classed as Neolithic, has been found alongside pottery which is dated to a much later period. The suggestion of northern invaders being responsible for this strange unexpected mixture has to take into consideration the fact that these northern invaders were Neolithic people who are supposed to have disappeared off the stage a few thousand years earlier. This coarse pottery actually turns up at a number of different sites and merely shows that, just like today, it is down to what the family can afford. At approximately 1 metre by 3.2 metres, the chamber of HD 78 at Tel al-Hammam was larger than average. It contained over 40 ceramic vessels spanning almost 2,000 years from the Chalcolithic period, Early Bronze Age and Intermediate Bronze Age, including jugs and small juglets, bowls and amphorisci. The suggestion that the contents of one small chamber contains pottery spanning 2,000 years of history is simply untenable. Yet archaeologists simply will not challenge their basic assumptions. In the Bible, we are told that Israel was given the land promised to Abraham, not because of their own righteousness, but rather because of the wickedness of the nations. The Greeks tell us that before the arrival of the Israelites, the inhabitants of the land of Canaan had turned to cannibalism. The people of Jericho, in what is known as the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, kept plastered skulls. The skulls seem to have been removed from these bodies after their burial, but before decomposition was complete, a somewhat gruesome business. Further excavation revealed that it had been regular practice in the pre-pottery Neolithic B period at Jericho to bury the body beneath the floor of the house, removing the skull. Plastered skulls were found at other similar sites dating to this period. This is what the Bible means by the wickedness of the nations. It is during this pre-pottery Neolithic B period that we find evidence of subsidence causing the walls to collapse. The Israeli archaeologist Michael Avi-Yonah tells us that in all the areas excavated, the buildings and surfaces of the period are eroded on an angle sloping down to the exterior of the town, often very steeply. The terrace walls, which were an essential part of the layout on the slopes of the mound, had collapsed in whole or in part, and the fill and the floors behind them had been washed out, often to the depth of several layers. It is impossible to estimate the length of the period of abandonment that produced this erosion. Once an earthquake or violent rains had made breaches in the terrace walls, the washout process could have proceeded rapidly if there were a series of heavy rains, but less violent conditions might have slowed down the erosion over a long period. Note that the walls and buildings show signs of collapse on a steep incline. Avi-Yonah assumed that this subsidence occurred at some point in time, long after the city's destruction. He did not make any connection with the biblical event, simply because it seemed to him to have occurred a few millennia before the time of the Exodus, long before Joshua was even born. An earthquake, which is an act of God, may well have assisted in the process of causing the walls to collapse. Note that the city of Ai, which was also conquered by Joshua, was still occupied during this period. At any other later settlement period of Jericho's history, the city of Ai will have been in ruins. I should perhaps mention that because the site originally proposed for the location of Ai was unoccupied during the period to which archaeologists are trying to date the Exodus, a second candidate for the city of Ai has recently been proposed. However, by dating the Exodus to the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, The location originally proposed for the city of Ai now holds good. In separate videos, I demonstrate how the Assyrian chronology can be reduced by around 1000 years, and the Egyptian chronology by around 2000 years. Because archaeologists are generally unaware of the tampering of monumental evidence by the Assyrians, Babylonians and Egyptians, and of the desire of those people to prove that their nation was the oldest, they have unwittingly accepted their works without proper scrutiny. They have unwittingly built on the incorrect interpretations of their predecessors, with the result that the archaeological evidence is being dated far too early, making their interpretation of that evidence completely out of synchronization with the written evidence. Note that this pre-pottery Neolithic B period has been dated to around 6000 BCE. The Exodus occurred around 1500 BCE. This is what happens when we apply Thompson's spurious age theory to the archaeological results. This brings us on to the big daddy of all false teachings, that of Stonehenge. Archaeological excavations at Stonehenge revealed problems with the accepted dates of 2500 BCE for Stonehenge. And if Stonehenge was early, that is 3100 to 2500 BC, why were the sets of Y and Z holes dug in the Iron Age the best part of 1000 years later? And why was the site so scattered with Romano-British pottery? The Y and Z holes mentioned above are understood to date to the final phase of the construction work at Stonehenge. There was a motley of finds in the holes, ware of the Middle Bronze Age, pieces of bluestone and rhyolite, a human tooth, as well as Romano-British pottery and other later material. Archaeological evidence is being ignored, but it gets better. Following Lieutenant Colonel William Hawley's excavations in 1923, and prior to the excavation of holes YH and ZH16 by Atkinson et al. In 1953, the holes were assumed to be of Iron Age date at the earliest. This was largely as a result of a concentration of late pottery at a relatively low level in the holes, for example in ZH4 and YH11. Early, middle and late Iron Age material was present. Relatively large numbers of Romano-British coarsewares and some finewares, including possible imports, were also recovered from these features, as were small quantities of early Middle Saxon, that is 5th to 8th century of the Common Era, and medieval sherds, late 12th to early 14th century of the Common Era. This presence of late artifacts is simply ignored. They simply dismiss it as being, quote, intrusive. Radiocarbon dating has been used by archaeologists to assist in their dating of the site. Quoting Chippendale, the radiocarbon dates move most features by, in many cases, as much as 500 years. The initial elements move from about 2500 back to 2950 BC. The Sarsen circle and trilithons from about 1900 BC back to 2400 BC. The bluestone horseshoe from about 1300 BC back to 1900 BC. These many large moves dislocate and reset also all chronological equations. But how accurate is radiocarbon dating? In 1963, Keith and Anderson found that when live mollusks were subjected to radiocarbon dating, it showed that they were around 2000 years old. Live mollusks which supposedly died 2000 years ago. In 1971, radiocarbon dating of a freshly killed seal showed that it died 1300 years ago. Shells from living snails were likewise shown to be 27,000 years old. So what is causing this? It has been found that live aquatic plants also exhibit this same phenomenon. This phenomenon is scientifically known as the radiocarbon reservoir effect. The problem is generally attributed to calcium carbonates. So, what are calcium carbonates? Well, calcium carbonates are calcium, lime, chalk and marble. Bear in mind that most of southern England, including the land at Stonehenge, is chalky soil. This means that we have to reduce the radiocarbon dates for Stonehenge by at least 2,000 years. More than 50% of the Neolithic burial sites contemporary with Stonehenge contained items which date to the period of Roman occupation, if not later. And yet they are consistently dated several thousands of years earlier. In an attempt to explain away this anomaly, Howard Williams of Chichester University has written a thesis entitled Ancient Landscapes and the Dead: The Reuse of Prehistoric and Roman Monuments as Early Anglo-Saxon Burial Sites. In this paper, he is effectively suggesting that the Saxons came along, saw a mound of earth which must by that time have been a few thousand years old, so it would have been buried in soil and covered with vegetation, dug it up, saw that it was a grave, and thought to themselves, "Oh, I'll reuse that." Not just once, but many times throughout many parts of Britain. What sort of mentality is this? Would it not be simpler to accept that the barrows, as well as Stonehenge itself, belonged to the period of Roman occupation? If a battle were to occur, would not both Saxon and Briton die in the same battle? Would not the Britons then have buried the dead together with their own men? Some barrows, such as that at Winster Moor in Derbyshire, are clearly of Anglo-Saxon date, as this barrow included a gold Greek cross, undoubtedly Christian. Many barrows contained Roman coins of late date, yet they are consistently dated many centuries earlier than their contents suggest. Some barrows in Northern Europe have even been dated to the 1st century of the Common Era. It is claimed that these barrows are Neolithic, and Neolithic, according to the evolution-based method of dating employed by archaeologists, where humans supposedly started off as primitive hunters, automatically means 3000 BCE or earlier. Note that we are lacking in barrows or any other graves which date to the period in between the supposed Neolithic cultures of around 3000 to 2000 BCE and those of the Anglo-Saxon period, 500 of the Common Era onwards, when they were still burying their dead in barrows. Can we honestly believe that the people of Roman Britain reused cemeteries which, by the archaeologists' own estimation, were already by that time a few thousand years old? But this is what they are claiming. But it gets even more damning, as I am about to disclose. So bear with me on this. We are just preparing the groundwork here. So what do the written records tell us? Well, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which is one of the oldest surviving historical records that we possess chronicling the Saxon invasions of Britain, in 495 AD, Cerdic and his son Cynric sailed to Britain with 5 ships to a port called Cerdic's Ora, and on the same day fought a battle against the Britons in which they were finally victorious. An ora is a landing place for ships. Writing in 1910, Edmund McClure informs us that Cerdic's Ora, ora equals shore, according to Ethelwerd, was on the River Avon, this being the river which flows close to Stonehenge, and Mr. Plummer would place it at Charford below Salisbury, but this is a long way to bring 5 ships up from the sea. As Cerdic's Ora is also a landing place of the West Saxons from 3 ships in AD 514, The place, if it ever existed, was probably somewhere else. At the time this was written, no one had a clue where this landing place for ships could possibly have been located. But in 2013, archaeologists found the avenue which ran down from Stonehenge to the River Avon. This is the only place along the whole of that river which is a candidate for Cerdig's Ora. I find it strange that archaeologists are suggesting that this is the landing place for the ships which brought the bluestones, which they say was sourced from Wales, yet they have not made the obvious connection with the Cerdig's Ora of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. I would suggest that the classification of Stonehenge as a Neolithic structure is the main influencing factor preventing them from coming to this conclusion. This is a map showing Stonehenge, which is here. This is the processional way referred to as the Avenue. And this must be Cerdig's Ora, the place where the Saxon king landed and massacred the people who were at that time dwelling at Stonehenge. For the record, the Saxon ships were flat-bottomed, like this one unearthed at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk. When we mention ships, there is a tendency to imagine deep-keeled ships. Julius Caesar, when discussing the ships used by the Gauls who were travelling back and forth to Britain, informs us that they used flat-bottomed craft as well. The ships of the Gauls were built and equipped in the following fashion. Their keels were considerably more flat than those of our own ships, that they might more easily weather shoals and ebb tide. Their prows were very lofty, and their sterns were similarly adapted to meet the force of waves and storms. The ships were made entirely of oak to endure any violence and buffeting. The cross pieces were beams of a foot thick, fastened with iron nails as thick as a thumb. A flat-bottomed ship like this would have been able to travel that far upriver, especially if the river was deeper at that time. Bear in mind also that rivers have a habit of changing over time. We should not look at the river today and assume that it has always been that shallow. We know that the bluestones were taken to Stonehenge from Wales, so this is the most obvious way that they could have been transported. I would once again stress that this landing place below Stonehenge is the only landing place for ships along the whole of that river that we know of. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles continue by telling us that in 514 AD, 6 years after, Stufan Widgar landed in Britain at Cerdig's Ora, and suddenly make war on the Britons whom they put to flight, and themselves remain masters of the field. Thus was completed the 56th year since Hengist and Horsa first landed in Britain. 519 AD. 5 years after, Cerdic and Cynric fought a battle against the Britons at Cerdig's Ford on the River Avon, and that same year Nomaly began to reign. In 552 of the Common Era, or 552 AD, should you prefer to use that terminology, Cerdic's son Kenric fought a battle against the Britons near the town of Old Sarum, a town which was later rebuilt further south and called Salisbury. This is the very first mention of Old Sarum. It is not difficult to work out that the people who built Old Sarum were the ones from Stonehenge who survived the battle against the Saxons. This map shows the location of Old Sarum, here called Old Salisbury, in relation to Stonehenge. They later moved further south to build the town which would become the present-day town of Salisbury. Bear with me because I haven't finished yet. According to one tradition still popular during William Camden's time, this being the 16th century of the Common Era, Stonehenge was erected as a memorial to mark the deaths of those slain in a bloody battle which occurred there. If you can recall, Cerdic and his son fought against the inhabitants of this land. This is said to have been a bloody battle. So, whilst the tradition preserved by Camden that Stonehenge was erected as a memorial It was not erected in the sense that it was built as a memorial. It more correctly became a memorial. Of course, with any battle there will be casualties on both sides. What then do you do with the dead? You would bury them in your graves, of course. The idea that the Saxons reused graves which were a few thousand years old is complete and utter nonsense. And now for the best part of the evidence. The people of Stonehenge are referred to by archaeologists as the Beaker people, after the distinctive type of pottery which they used. This type of ware was common throughout many parts of Europe. It has been called the bell beaker culture because of the inverted bell beaker drinking vessel peculiar to this type of pottery, as you can see from the picture on the right. In a separate video entitled Britannicae Nessos, the Britannic Isles, I trace the migratory paths of the Bruti, Samniti and Lucanians of southern Italy northwards and westwards through France and Spain. Note that Bruti is the Latin name for this tribe. The Greeks called them Bretians. When we superimpose the movements of these three tribes onto a map of the recorded bell beaker distribution as shown here, we find that there is an undeniable correlation which shows that, despite archaeologists dating this form of pottery to around 3000 to 2000 BCE, the people using this pottery did not even arrive in many of those areas until a much later date. In fact, these three tribes, the Bruti, Samniti and Lucanians, were still in southern Italy in 199 BCE when, according to the written records, they had their civil rights removed because they assisted Hannibal in his aborted attempt at overthrowing Rome. They were reduced to effectively becoming slaves. According to the Greek writer Appian, when Hannibal had departed from Italy, the Senate pardoned all the Italian peoples who had sided with him and voted a general amnesty, except as to the Brutians who remained most zealous for him to the end. From these they took away a considerable part of their land, also their arms if there were any that Hannibal had not taken. They were also forbidden to be enrolled in the military forces thereafter as being no longer free persons, and they were required to attend as servants upon the consuls and praetors who went about inspecting the affairs of government and the public works of the provinces. This removal of their civil rights resulted in these tribes leaving Italy to establish their own governments elsewhere. For more information on this, I would recommend that you watch my video Britannicae Nessos. I would perhaps mention that, according to the Greek writer Strabo and the Latin writer Pliny, the Lucanians were a breakaway faction of Samniti. The Lucanians were therefore Samniti. The relevance of this statement will become evident in a moment. One contingent of these Bruti and Samniti settled here in Brittany. The Bruti became known as Namniti or Nanetes, both forms of the name being used interchangeably. They built the city of Nantes, which name is but a phonetic variation on the name Nanetes. Note that the bell beaker pottery found in this region cannot possibly date any earlier than the 2nd century BCE. Another contingent broke off and settled in eastern France on the German border, though such border would not have existed at that time. The name Nemetis is another phonetic variation on the name Nanetes, whilst the name Luci is a contracted form of the name Lucanian. Again, the bell beaker pottery found here cannot date any earlier than the 2nd century BCE. Some of those who settled in Brittany went on to settle in Kent in Britain. These settlers who were the first to settle in Britain are first mentioned by Polybius as being there in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. Julius Caesar, who invaded Britain in 50 BCE, informs us that Britain was at that time being ruled from Gaul with someone called Galba as their king. We do not know where Galba was ruling from, though it would be a reasonable assumption to claim that he was ruling from the city of Nantes, this being an important naval city and port at that time. The Trinovantes and Kenimani, who were recorded by Julius Caesar as at that time dwelling in Kent, were Namnitai and Samnitai respectively. Note that Trinovantes means 3 Novantae. This name Novantae is the anglicised form of the Latin. Note that in Latin the V was pronounced as a U. Hence the name, which is written Satvernus, is actually pronounced Saturnus. These Novantae were called Nuantes by Ptolemy. Compare this name Nuantes with that of Nanetes and Nance. You will notice that I am pronouncing this name as Nance as opposed to Nantes. We should bear in mind that languages change over time. The French at some time in the past dropped the pronunciation of the letter S. On examining the evidence, Nantes seems most likely to have been the original pronunciation of the name. The same can probably be said about the name which I am pronouncing as Nanetes, this being the name used by both Julius Caesar and the Latin writer Pliny. Today the French would perhaps pronounce this word as Nonnet. Bear in mind that whilst we cannot be sure how the Romans would have actually pronounced this name, and even I am guessing at the pronunciation, if the people of Brittany were pronouncing it as Nonnet, then these Latin writers would have written Nonnetes rather than Nanetes. After Julius Caesar's invasion, these 2 tribes, the Trinovantes and the Kenimani, crossed over the River Thames and settled in Norfolk and Suffolk. The Kenimani now became known as Iceni, though Ptolemy called them Cimeni. The 16th century English historian William Camden recognised that all 3 of these names belonged to the same people, but assumed that Ptolemy had made a mistake by calling them Cimeni. William Harrison, in the 16th century work known as Holinshed's Chronicles, informs us that these Iceni were also known as Semnotai. The names Cimeni and Semnotai are both phonetic variations on the name Samnitai. Furthermore, the name Iceni is a variation on the name Lucanian or Luceni. Knowing that the Samnitai also call themselves Kenimani, it doesn't take too much intelligence to realise that the Kenumani who dwelt in Brittany alongside the Samnitai and Namnitai were also Samnitai. Julius Caesar makes it perfectly clear that the tribes of Britain were named after their mainland counterparts in Europe. Nearly all of these latter are called after the names of the states from which they sprang when they went to Britain, he tells us. These early British settlers have therefore all migrated from these tribes who were located in Brittany. No one seems to have made the philological connection between the names of these British tribes with those of their mainland counterparts in Brittany. It would take too long to go into here, but these early settlers were splitting up into smaller family units in the selfsame way that the first American settlers did when they arrived in America. There were other Samnitai recorded in northern Italy as well as in southern France, in addition to those settlers I am drawing your attention to here. In the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era, or 2nd century AD if you prefer to use that terminology, the Novantae, called Nuantes by Ptolemy, were located here in Galloway and Carrick. Again, the Bell Beaker pottery could not have appeared here prior to that date. Writing in 1527, the Scottish historian Hector Boethus, sometimes called Hector Boes, informs us that the Novantae were also known as Silures. This means that the Silures who settled here in East Wales were also Novantae. This separation of the Novantae into 3 separate parties is clearly what gave the Welsh monk Geoffrey of Monmouth inspiration for his contrived story of Brutus and his 3 sons. I noticed that no Bell Beaker pottery has yet been found in this region, but it does not follow that such pottery was not in use, merely that none has yet been uncovered. Another branch of the Bruti, calling themselves Numantes, settled here in northern Spain alongside a people called Luckensi by Strabo. Note that the name Numantis is a phonetic variation on the name Namnetai. When these Namnetai migrated to Ireland sometime in the 4th century of the Common Era, they became known as Nanetai, this being a variant spelling of Nanetes or Nant. Numante, Namnetai, Nanetes, Nuantes and Nants are all phonetic variations on the same name. The Luckensi, when they arrived in Ireland, became known as Luceni. They settled on one side of the River Shannon in Connaught, whilst the Nanetai settled opposite them on the other side of the river. The realisation that the Luceni were descended from the Luckensi of Spain was made long ago by the 16th century English historian William Camden. Once again, the appearance of the Bell Beaker pottery in this region in Ireland cannot date any earlier than the 4th century of the Common Era, which is when these tribes arrived. We therefore have a lot of connections here which show a clear migration route of these various tribes. But archaeologists seem intent on pushing back history to some remote and distant past, using spurious dating methods to support their claims. The evidence further mounts as we look at other Celtic tribes. The Parisii, the people who founded the city of Paris, are first recorded as having arrived there during the time of Julius Caesar, in the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era. It can be shown that they were in Delphi in Greece in 278 BCE. These Parisii were clearly responsible for the appearance of the Bell Beaker pottery in this region. Under the name Frisi, these Parisii arrived in Germany around 12 BCE. Some of these Parisii crossed over into Britain sometime either at the end of the 1st or the beginning of the 2nd century of the Common Era, with some later moving into this region of Scotland around 374 of the Common Era. The Aedui are recorded as having arrived in this region of southern France in the 4th century before the Common Era. Pliny records that a breakaway faction of these Aedui settled much further downstream, close to the city of Tours. Julius Caesar tells us that a contingent of these Aedui crossed over into Britain in the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era. This particular contingent of Aedui became the Ordowices, who settled in this region of North Wales, though the anglicised form of the Latin would suggest that the name should be read as Ordovices. Ordowices is the Greek spelling of the name and would have been the original pronunciation of the Latin as well. This addition of "icky" on the ends of names was a common Celtic practice. Pliny, for example, called the Celts Celtici. The Umbrians of northern Italy were called Umbrici, and so on. The evidence just piles up and is overwhelming. The Dominions and Caroons who arrived in southern Britain from Ireland were also using this pottery. In a separate video, I shall demonstrate that these Irish tribes arrived in Britain sometime either at the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd century of the Common Era. The Irish records, however, which are a complete mess thanks to the monks who have messed around with the historical records, would have us believe that this mass migration occurred around 1000 BCE. For the purposes of this video presentation, it is sufficient that you can see the correlation between these various tribes and the distribution of the Bell Beaker pottery. Note that the Caroons were transporting the tin to Spain. The city of Corunna in northern Spain appears to be named after these Caroons, some of whom settled in the far north of Scotland. The arrival of the Belbeker pottery in this part of North Africa likewise coincides with the arrival there of the Vandals and the Alans, who arrived there from southern Spain around 429 of the Common Era, or 429 AD if you prefer. The presence of this pottery in Sardinia and the Balearic Islands likewise occurs with the arrival there of the Vandals around 456 of the Common Era. It would take too long to go into in this video, but I can confirm that Stonehenge was built by the Belgae, who arrived in Britain from Ireland along with the Dominions, Caroons and other Irish tribes in a mass migration event which occurred sometime between the time of Pliny, whose works are dated to around 77 of the Common Era, and the time of Ptolemy, who wrote his geography in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era. These Irish tribes settled in Devon and Cornwall, the western parts of Wales, in large areas of northern England and in various parts of Scotland. If you want to know more, you can visit my website where you can download my books Ancient Irish History Reconsidered and The Forgotten Tribe of Naphtali and the Phoenicians free of charge. Hopefully you can now see how ludicrous this Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age theory actually is. And yet it is still highly regarded as an accurate means of dating by the majority of archaeologists. This false teaching is used to undermine the authority not only of the Bible, but of all the written records. There is a lot of kudos attached to producing evidence which shows the great antiquity of the human race. After all, you can make raw data say whatever you want it to say. Archaeologists are simply interpreting the evidence according to what they want it to say, and then claiming that they are following the science. But this is not science, it is pseudoscience, science falsely so called. Do you not think that it is about time we put the record straight?